What I want to do now is to introduce our next speaker, which for many, certainly in the UK, and he's well travelled overseas also, is our Surveillance Camera Commissioner, Tony Porter. He's an intelligence specialist, most recently within the financial sector, and he's a retired senior police leader. His experience spans community and business engagements, international counter-terrorism, and serious organised crime. Tony's commission as the Surveillance Camera Commissioner comes to an end at the end of December. So, in particular, he's been a great supporter of our events over recent years. But we're delighted to have him with us again, and perhaps one of his last speaking engagements in his current role. Tony, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good to see you, my friend. Good to see you. Anyway, the floor is yours now. I'll leave you to it.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be at Global MSC for what may well be my last public contribution as a Surveillance Camera Commissioner in England and Wales. I've certainly enjoyed the hospitality of Global for 7 years. They are, by any measure, the finest provider of finger buffets, which none of us are receiving for today's efforts. But if you happen to get to next year's conference, I do urge you to go. But more importantly, Global, in my view, represent a unique brand of conference, security conference. The caliber of input is always extraordinarily high, and the caliber of challenge I face in the panel is usually pretty tough. And it's tough because I'm dealing with people who understand the business, and that's why I insist on coming. So thank you, Global, for inviting me, and thank you for the delegates for tuning into this input. Over the 7 years I've been Commissioner, I've introduced at Global a number of firsts. I've introduced my certification scheme for public sector video cameras. I introduced the National Surveillance Camera Strategy over 3.5 years ago now. Broader schemes such as secure by default monitoring, and I intend to encourage the new Commissioner next year to launch a product we've been working on this year, which is for consultants installers. So there's a lot to tune into. But today, I'm going to talk about facial recognition. And I'm going to talk about the case that became a global first, I think, in one of the most senior courts in the world to deal with the challenges of facial recognition and its legality. And what I hope to do during the course of this conversation is talk about some of the observations, some of the recommendations to act as guidance for those of you in the industry that want to understand perhaps how to take this forward. So as I say, I've learned the lessons from that court case, and I've now drafted a full and comprehensive guidance that will be used by law enforcement. As we speak, that guidance is with my Queen's Counsel, my legal team that represented me at the Court of Appeal, and in it is a whole range of recommendations that I hope will provide some light to people here that are desperately looking for that light. So I guess this is another first where this conference will hear my thoughts and opinions and indications in relation to the use of facial recognition. Now, those of you at home that happen to listen to the Prime Minister on his daily COVID conference would have been taken aback by the number of metaphors used. And I thought, well, I'm going to have a metaphor here. And I would say, in terms of facial recognition in the UK, and I actually think globally, I think there are some sunny uplands for its use. But there are crocodiles in the ravine that need to be navigated around. And hopefully what I'm about to say will provide some guidance. I want to take you back to 2017, when I became aware for the first deployment of LFR, facial recognition, on a screen in Piccadilly, London. A huge LED screen that caused quite some public contention. And I was contacted by the Times and the Telegraph as the Surveillance Commissioner, and they wanted to know from me its legality, they wanted to know the issues that were raised, they wanted to know what we do about it. Now, I've always endeavoured to be brutally honest in this role, and I hope that that has been respected and recognised by the community that represent. And the bottom line is, I didn't know. It was very complicated. What were the rules? What's the legislation? How should we move forward with this? Is there a law? And I didn't feel fit to answer, so I didn't. I actually stayed silent, and I'm rather glad I did. So let me take you back into Bridges. I mentioned the case. I was, together with the Home Secretary, the Information Commissioner and the Police and Crime Commissioner from South Wales Police, what's called an amicus curiae, or an interested party. And in both the Divisional Court and in the Court of Appeal, I was more than that. I was a fascinated party because this was law in the making. And I actually tuned in for the 3 days in the Court of Appeal. Nearly every minute. I couldn't quite make every minute because my daughter was getting graduated at one point and I did that online. But it was fascinating following the arguments that came out of that, which I'm going to espouse here. Divisional Court said it was lawful. Mr. Bridges walked past a van in South Wales Police that was using facial recognition. He felt that he had had his biometrics processed unlawfully. The Divisional Court in 2019 said, no, we think that's okay. Court of Appeal in July 2020, this year, heard it and said, no, we don't agree. We think that it failed on 3 grounds. We don't think it was in accordance with the law. We don't think that the police complied with the public sector equality duties. And we think its application of the data protection impact assessment was a little bit wonky. Now, very, very interesting indeed. So how do we move forward in that? Well, the lessons I learned from that, the Court of Appeal, more at the top of its judgment, recognised that the role of the Surveillance Camera Commissioner and the Code of Practice regulates the use of live facial recognition. Together with other laws, of course, but they recognise the key role of this office and whoever comes forward as being an overseer of the regulation. Both courts also approved my contention that the Code of Practice amounts to a whole system approach. So those of you in the business of surveillance, I do urge you to ensure that you're fully au fait with the Code of Practice. Finally, they said it incorporates and signposts not just the systems and standards and the validation that allows it to be used lawfully, but it also signposts common law, Regulation of Investigation Powers Act, Data Protection Act, GDPR, human rights, public sector equality, and health and safety. It is a basket of confusion, and people out there need a navigator, they need a Sherpa to help you through. So nice words, Commissioner, thank you so much. Now please jump off the fence. Is it lawful? Can we use this technology, or is it not? Well, as I said, there are sunny uplands, and I would say yes. I would say Bridges was very clear in saying that in the right circumstances, it can be used lawfully. But of course, if you used it in the same circumstances of Bridges, then it would be unlawful. The criticisms in the judgment were very specific. Let's look at what they were. Firstly, it wasn't in accordance with the law. So the police needed to focus much more closely on the who was in the watch list and the where that you're looking for the people on the watch list. I've touched on the algorithm bias, the human rights, the evidence capability, all of which needs to feed into legality in police public sector duties. The police didn't do that. And the court said that it's a process, not a product. So every element of the process needs to be in tandem and in step with PSED. And of course, the DPIA needed to be more comprehensive, it needed to be more focused, it needs to be narrowed down. And that's lessons that every organisation can take. Another key lesson for us all is that as a third party working with the police, whether that's a local authority, retail, train station, any of those, the third parties have to comply with the Protection of Freedoms Act and the broader duties therein. Please do not be deluded to think that compliance of facial recognition is compliance to GDPR. The Court of Appeal said it's much broader than that. Data protection is very important, but it's not the only thing to take into account. Legal bit, very quickly. Law enforcement operates under Part 3 of the Data Protection Act. That's slightly different to retail, the private sector, which falls within, wait for it, Schedule 1, Part 1 of the Data Protection Act, Schedule 1, Part 2 of the Data Protection Act. You need appropriate policy documents, you need data protection impact assessments, you need Article 6 justification, Article 9 conditions. And if you fall in some of those conditions, there are 20 options. It is very comprehensive. So you really, really do need to have a step guide as to go through this process. So there are two elements depending where you sit. I'm going to deal with the police because that was the bridges, and I've got a short period of time left. So I've produced a report that will be going to police officers, to police chiefs, Home Office, ministers next week. One recommendation is that there needs to be a national procurement strategy for police, that LFR technology needs to be suitable to be able to analyse, to make sure that there's backdoors that can test the algorithms, make sure there's no bias for the algorithms, that there needs to be national standards of that technology within that procurement strategy. I'm going to go through these recommendations at something of a hoof, but I think if you actually take a note, jot them down, you'll start to get an understanding about the complexity. Second recommendation, there needs to be ethical oversight. This isn't just protection of freedoms or data protection or common law. It's freedom of human rights. So I'm recommended the police ethics infrastructure, or indeed the National Digital and Data Ethics Committee. It's a new body, takes notice and oversees. In the retail or private, how you address ethics is a different challenge, but I would urge you to consider it. Another big recommendation is that there needs to be, in my view, an integrated impact assessment. Why? Because if you just look at the volume of assessments you need to do, whether it's DPIA, legitimacy impact assessment, appropriate policy, whether it's operational risk deployment, whether it's a self-assessment tool under POFA, there's probably at the last count 10 to 12. This is impossible, and it needs to be harmonized. And I said this, I think, at the last time I attended Global, and I'll say it again. I think the regulators can do much more to make this an easier terrain for the users. I've endeavored to do that in my time. I haven't always been successful, but I have gained support from some of the regulators that have worked in tandem with me in developing the guidance. Another recommendation is cyber protection, of course, secure by default. Design is part of data protection, but it's also part of the Protection of Freedoms Act. Can your backdoors be hacked? In facial recognition dealings with the most sensitive areas of data processing, so you need to make sure that you have a very solid and robust cyber defence mechanism. Recommendation 6, the government needs to update the code of practice. I've been public and said that I think the Home Office let the police down to an extent. I've called for an update of the code for the last 4 or 5 years. I'm delighted to say that it's now being done. But the police need solid ground to walk upon if they're pushing the boundaries of the law. And I think to an extent they were let down. They needed more solid boundaries and they had to navigate. There were sentinels in the mist. It wasn't clear the direction they were going and they had to take a direction. Because I believe this technology will and must be used. And when I said that at a conference in Brussels, it was like tumbleweed rolling across the ground. To say that there was an awful lot of liberals there is one thing, a lot of academics, and I love liberals and I love academics, but actually I also love pragmatists. And this is technology that can save us, save lives, make life better for us all. So let's be sensible about developing criteria around its use. There needs to be a decision-making model for the police around watch lists, about authorizations, an independent authorizing officer, not the officer who's deploying the technology in their own instance. That's akin to marking your own homework. The police might not like this too much because it's more bureaucracy, but I think the 70-odd million people in the country would be reassured that when this highly technical kit is being deployed, it's being deployed under scrutiny. It's being deployed because it's necessary and proportionate. Recommendation 8, I'll go to my notes, a human decision maker. We need to standardize the role of a human decision maker. What's the selection? What's the training program? What's the profile? How do we deploy them? How do we know they're any good? This is a serious role where somebody is deciding upon the infringement of somebody's liberties. Well, let's make sure that that role is a role enshrined in policy, enshrined in training, and is actually something that develops towards a professional direction. I've touched on a relevant suite of performance indicators. I think that's really clear. We need that. And really that takes me, I think, to, I'm coming towards the end of my 15 minutes and coming towards the end potentially of my final speech as Surveillance Commissioner. I've said before and I say again, I believe there needs to be a review of overt surveillance. I'm a big fan of surveillance, but not so much a big fan of bad surveillance. I think overt surveillance is now that powerful. There needs to be controls. There needs to be stronger regulatory oversight. And I think that that can be developed with new statutes to incorporate these new and powerful technologies, whether it's ANPR, live facial recognition, live streaming of body worn. It's now as powerful as covert surveillance. Whether it's as intrusive is another matter, but it's certainly as powerful. And the government need to listen to this and move forward. That's the second to last thing. The last thing I want to say is a thank you to Global, because you've been a great friend of my commission for 7 years, and I say that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you to the many people who I've seen over the 7 years. You've been great friends. I know most of you when I turn up, and it's like coming home. And Derek, thank you for the finger buffet. It is outstanding, and I'm going to aim to get there next year because it's just worth the trip to Bristol. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, as you well know, and I can assure you there's no finger buffet here today in the studio, but we do have a miraculously appearance of a box of celebration chocolates, so that's the best we could do for you if you were here.